Okay, Chair now recognizes Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. I have an amendment at the desk, I believe.
The clerk will distribute the amendment to all members. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5750 as offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. I reserve a point of order. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given that H.R. 5750 would arbitrarily and without any meaningful study extend the standard probationary period for most new federal employees from 1 to 2 years, this amendment would strike this misguided legislation in its entirety. My amendment would also replace the text of the underlying bill with a common sense requirement that the Independent Government Accountability Office, which is the main watchdog of the federal government, must first review the impact of prior extensions of probationary periods at the Department of Defense. We've done this before, not only at DOD, but also the United States Postal Service. And both of those experiences have been cautionary in terms of our ability to compete with the private sector and the consequences of losing so many good employees. We've also seen this at other federal agencies on agency mission and operations. Employee performance and the recruitment and retention of highly qualified federal workers is affected. While I firmly believe that there are members on both sides of the aisle who are committed to strengthening our federal workforce and the delivery of critical services that federal employees provide to the American people, the wholesale and arbitrary extension of the statutory probationary period for the majority of civil service employees will severely undermine both of these goals. The American Federation of Government Employees and the National Treasury Employees Union and other employee organizations representing more than 2 million federal employees have repeatedly warned that this proposal would be detrimental to the federal workforce, morale, recruitment, and retention. Importantly, federal probationary employees do not receive the full due process protections, including appeal rights that are afforded to permanent federal workers, and therefore are limited in their ability to challenge unfair disciplinary actions and unlawful job terminations. They also do not enjoy full collective bargaining rights and are expressly excluded from standard labor agreements that protect federal workers against adverse employment actions. It is in view of these limitations and their impact on federal workforce morale that Congress, on a bipartisan basis, in 2021 repealed the pilot 2-year probationary period for new employees at the Department of Defense. It was not working. It was hurting our ability to attract good employees. We're in a competition here against the private sector, and we've done this before and it didn't work. Hello? This attempt to extend the period during which federal employees do not have full due process and other labor rights also comes amid a reduction of force of the federal workforce by targeting and firing probationary employees en masse. President Trump recently fired 200,000 federal employees. Didn't ask which ones were doing a good job, didn't ask which ones needed to be fired, just fired everybody. In April, President Trump issued an executive order significantly expanding the reasons allowing the removal of probationary employees, including firings based on an agency supervisory board's determination that continued employment would not, quote, advance organizational goals or serve agency needs of interest. Since taking office, President Trump has, in fact, as I said, fired more than 25,000 probationary federal employees across the federal government, from 2,400 probationary employees at the Department of Veterans Affairs, including the workers at the Veterans Suicide Hotline in the middle of a suicide crisis, to more than 3,000 probationary employees at the Department of Health and Human Services. These unlawful firings are still the subject of litigation filed by federal employee unions and pro-democracy advocates with the support of the Democratic House Litigation Task Force, of which I am a member. As reported by the Nonpartisan Partnership for Public Service and its Federal Harms Tracker, these and other attacks against our federal employees to date resulted in more than 211,000 federal civil service servants leaving the federal government, including nearly 13,000 employees at the VA, 15,000 employees at HHS, and over 60,000 employees at the Department of Defense. According to the partnership, which is dedicated to making government more efficient, and I quote, "This campaign to weaken the federal civil service has targeted the very people who keep our government running and provide essential services that we all rely on every day. Regrettably, the legislation before us does the same, and I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and oppose the underlying bill, and I yield that back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself to speak on the Lynch amendment. I want to thank Mr. Lynch for offering this amendment aimed at replacing the bill with a provision directing GAO to study the impact of lengthening probationary periods. However, I oppose this amendment, which would gut the underlying bill and deny its improvements to the federal workforce. The simple truth is that the underlying proposal, extending federal employee probationary periods and affirmative certification of employees' value to the federal government and American taxpayer, is not new, with the GAO itself having already studied this issue via a February 2015 report calling for these reforms. It's for these reasons that I oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to do the same. Chair now recognizes ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank Representative Lynch for offering this important amendment. Any organization, of course, needs to hire and fire the best people, but the legislation we're considering today is rushed and potentially, as we know, harmful. I support this amendment. Committee Democrats support this amendment, which would require the GAO to study how the bill would actually work before rushing through the changes that would allow the president to fire more federal workers. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and with that, we yield back. Yeah, and I'd like to yield Mr. Lynch some time.
Mr. Lynch.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to point out, so at the United States Postal Service, they had a very long probationary period. And when Postmaster General DeJoy came in, appointed by President Trump, he got rid of that. He got rid of that because we needed to bring on new employees, and it was such a drag, and it created such dissension among the workforce. And remember, the United States Postal Service has 100,000 less people today than it did 20 years ago. So they've been bringing in automation. They've been working with the unions there. It's not an adversarial relationship all the time. But I think, Postmaster General DeJoy knew his business. He knew operations. He knew efficiency. And he got rid of that voluntarily and said, this is hurting the organization. This is hurting our efficiency. So I'm going to do away with it. So now when folks come on, they don't have quote-unquote casual employees like they used to do years ago. They bring people in, and they train them, and they impress upon them they're in a career, and it's a good vibe and a good way to treat your employees with respect. So, take a look. I just advise members, take a look at what happened at DOD when we did this. We lost a lot of good employees, and we are in a daily competition. I see what's going on at the VA. We got nurses that can walk across the street at a private hospital and basically double their pay. So how do we get VA nurses to stay on the job? How do we get therapists? We got a lot of veterans that need care desperately, and President Trump just laid off 13,000, and we got a backlog of cases now. We're not taking care of our veterans, and this is going to make it worse. Because a new nurse with student loans is going to look at going on to the federal workforce and saying, okay, I'm going to have no rights for a couple of years, and if I go to a private hospital, the pay's better, the hours are probably a lot better, the benefits are better. How do we get that person to come to work at the VA? So there's real managerial problems with the underlying bill, and I'm trying to get at that. And this is not new. Some of us have been here a while. We've seen this before, and it didn't work out well. And this is not going to work out well either. So, but with that, I yield back my time to the ranking member.
Yield back. Chair recognizes Mr. Biggs from Arizona.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I would have sworn that I had heard earlier in this debate on this bill of the nonpartisan nature of the federal workforce. Now, there's about 2.3 million people in the federal workforce, according to the Office of Personnel Management. And I thought, well, it'd be interesting, if it's really nonpartisan, then we should see something pretty similar. I'm just going to take this as my variable. I'm going to look at donations to political campaigns just to see how that worked out. So of that federal workforce, 30% of donations went to Republicans and 70% went to Democrats. And that's interesting because it's by a 2-to-1 margin, better than 2-to-1 margin. It's not nonpartisan, it's very partisan. Two agencies didn't have any donations to Republicans at all, and not surprisingly, it is the Department of Education and the Office of Personnel Management. They didn't have any. And then, so I thought, well, what did they give to in the vice presidential race, or the presidential race when you had Vice President Kamala Harris running? 84% of federal employees gave money to Kamala Harris, and about 16% gave to President Trump. The ratio was $3.5 million to $675,000. And then somebody mentioned recently in the debate here about the unions, about the federal unions. And I thought that was interesting because let's see what they did. Well, AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees, 96% of donations in the last cycle went to Democrats. That's interesting. And then it was didn't perform as well for Democrats as the National Treasury Employees Union, which had 98% going to Democrats. And so the point being is, if you're arguing that somehow this bill is going to make us less partisan, I'm trying to conceive of how we could possibly be less partisan than we how we are so partisan now. I'm not sure that anything will actually shrink the partisanship that's there, and that's just why this is important. This bill is important because it actually gets to shrinking the federal government. And the fundamental difference that you see here is the arguments being made by my colleagues on the other side is that they don't want to shrink the federal government. And I want to shrink the federal government. I think the federal government is bloated and overbig. 2.4 million employees. That's a lot of folks working that could be doing something different. And we should probably shrink the footprint. We had an overwhelming vote yesterday to actually take down and reduce, and it was a bipartisan vote, to reduce the number of crimes created by regulation or statute. And there's, as I pointed out yesterday, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000 crimes created by regulation. Well, as long as you have fiefdoms created and you have people saying, well, I need to work here, and this is where I'm going to work, you're going to protect those. So everybody who voted yesterday to shrink or at least study, at least count, because we don't even know what the real number is, count the number of criminal violations in the regulations and statutes, to vote here today and say, well, we don't want to do this because it might reduce the size and scope of the federal government. I think those are disingenuous, or at least certainly incongruent arguments and positions. And so, Mr. Chairman, I have to regretfully oppose Mr. Lynch's proposed amendment, as well as support Mr. Gill's underlying bill, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any other members seek recognition? Chair recognizes Mr. Gill from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to support the underlying bill. Listen, this is a very common sense piece of legislation that simply says that we're going to have a 2-year probationary period for federal workers, during which time we can evaluate them and their managers can determine whether their employment for the federal government makes sense for American taxpayers. We hear that unions are opposed to this, and that's no surprise to anybody. But the reality is that we represent the American people whose tax dollars we are stewarding, not union bosses who are engaged in collective bargaining against the American taxpayer. Once federal workers are outside of this probationary period, they receive virtual tenure. They're incredibly difficult to fire or to get rid of. And the purpose of their employment is to serve the American people, to make federal services better. Our federal programs are not intended to be jobs programs for substandard government workers. So I urge my colleagues to support this common sense bill to ensure that federal workers are in fact meeting basic standards of competency, giving more discretion to managers to ensure that we are stewarding tax dollars appropriately, and as Mr. Biggs said, right-sizing the federal government. With that, I yield back.
Gilman yields back. Any other members wish to speak on the Lynch amendment? Representative Crane, Arizona.
Yeah, I oppose this amendment, and I just want to offer my full support for Mr. Gill's bill here, which would just increase the probationary period for federal employees from 1 year to 2 years. I think that's completely rational, and I think it does protect the American taxpayers. I joined a community in the Navy called Naval Special Warfare. I was on probation for 2 years. I knew that if I screwed up or didn't do my job or live up to the standards, I would be let go. And I had no problem with it because I wanted to be a part of a community that actually did its job and had standards. And so I commend Mr. Gill on his bill. I think it'll be good for the American people. The American people do feel like Washington, D.C. is extremely bloated. They know how difficult it is for us to get rid of bureaucrats who aren't doing their job, and I think this bill helps a lot. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well said. Any other members seek recognition? The question is now on the amendment offered by Mr. Lynch from Massachusetts. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Recorded vote, Mr. Chair.
A recorded vote is ordered. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed.